All good. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Brisbane.net user group, March edition. Quick bit of housekeeping if you haven't been here before. The bathrooms are at the end of the hall to the right. It's awesome to see you all back here and this community back in full swing. And we have a couple of cracker sessions today. First up, we have Jason Taylor, Solution Architect from Increment, who have also kindly sponsored this month's pizza for us. And Jason is going to be talking about flexible authorization with ASP.NET Core. Take it away, Jason.
Thank you.
If you will.
Hello, everyone. It's nice to see such a large group tonight. It's pretty cool. I'm very excited about Brisbane.net user group this year. I think you'll see me every month, and I'm excited to see the talks that might be coming from some of you, hopefully. I think Todd will probably talk about this, but I just mentioned that if you've got a talk and you want to submit to Bris.net user group, talk to Todd or one of the other organisers, and it'd be cool to see you. All right, so hello and welcome to Flexible Authorization with ASP.NET Core. My name's Jason Taylor, and I'm a solution architect at Increment. Increment is a technology services company that brings together some of the industry's most skilled technology professionals. At Increment, I help customers design, develop, test, and deploy custom solutions to the cloud. If you're interested in learning more about Increment, you can find them online at increment.inc. And you can find me online at my blog, Jason Taylor Dev, or on Twitter at Jason Taylor Dev. So in this talk, we're going to be looking at flexible authorization with ASP.NET Core. Before we get started, we'll look at the basic approach, which uses role-based access control, and then we'll look at a flexible approach, which uses permissions-based access control. And I'll show you how you can leverage ASP.NET Core authorization and extend it to provide an approach which is flexible in that it will have you doing less work to implement your permissions and change permissions. So a little bit of background before we get started. Authentication is the process of determining a user's identity, whereas authorization is the process which determines which resources a user can access. It's important to remember that authentication is independent of authorization, but authorization does require an authenticated user. So authorization determines access to resources, but what exactly is a resource? Well, it could be a number of things. It could be access to a feature, or access to a file, or some data in the database. It also includes defining and enforcing access control rules as policies, which are then enforced by the system using access control checks. So the focus of this talk will be authorization with ASP.NET Core. As mentioned, I'll show you an initial approach which will use role-based authorization, and I'll show you how that approach can be difficult to maintain and become largely inflexible for large applications. I'll then show you a flexible approach to overcome these limitations. For demonstrations, I'll be showing a Blazor WebAssembly app built on ASP.NET Core, and I'll share a link to the code and slides at the end of the presentation. All right, so with ASP.NET Core authorization, of course it supports simple authorization capabilities, such as denying access to a user who is not authenticated. It also includes sophisticated authorization capabilities, such as role-based, claims-based, policy-based, resource-based, view-based. So as an example for role-based authorization, we could check that someone is in the administrator's role. It's easy to create custom authorization policies, which will be the engine of the flexible authorization engine we'll be looking at. And it's also easy to customize the behavior of the authorization middleware. ASP.NET Core gives us everything we need out of the box. Let's take a look at some examples of simple authorization. So in its simplest form, ASP.NET Core authorization has an authorize attribute, and you can apply that to a controller, action, or razor page. In this example, we have an account controller, and the authorize attribute has been applied to the entire controller. So in actual fact, this is a problem because the user can't log in. In the next example, we fixed that. We've shifted it down to just the logout action. So a user who is anonymous, in this case, can access the login action, and a user who is authenticated, authorized in its simplest form, can then log out. Next up, we're using the authorize attribute again. So now all of the actions in the accounts controller will require an authenticated user, except of course for the login action where we've applied the allow anonymous attribute. So for role-based authorization, we get to use that attribute again. We're here in this administrators controller, we're specifying that only a user that is within the role administrators can access this controller and the actions within. In this example, the user needs to be a member of either the administrators or the accounts role, not both. And in this final example, the authorization system will say you must be a member of the administrator's role and you must also be a member of the accounts role. So you can see you can combine the authorize attribute in interesting ways to enforce the policy that you'd like to enforce. Let's have a look at policy-based authorization. So in this example, again, using the authorize attribute, we're applying a policy called employees only. And this declares that only authenticated users who meet the requirements of the employees only policy will be allowed access to the employees controller. And we can easily define these policies, perhaps in startup when we're registering our services, or program.cs now. We can say for this employees only policy, they require a claim called employee number. In this case, it's just sufficient to have that claim, the value is not important. Now let's have a look at authorization in Blazor WebAssembly. Because Blazor WebAssembly is an ASP.NET Core technology, it supports those same authorization capabilities. So it includes sophisticated authorization capabilities such as role-based, claims-based, and policy-based, as well as those simple basic ones such as allow anonymous and authorize for just an authenticated user. It includes also some helpful authorization components, such as authorize view to conditionally show part of a view dependent on the user's authorization, and authorize route view to restrict access to certain routes based on the user's authorization. Now, having said that Blazor WebAssembly supports authorization, it's important to remember that it's just a UI, UX concern in this case. A lot of these checks can be bypassed, so it's important that they're still enforced on the back end, just as you would for an Angular, Vue, or React application. So let's now look at some quick examples for Blazor WebAssembly. So here we're applying the authorize attribute to a routable page. So only users who are authenticated will be able to access the home page. In this case, we're allowing anonymous users to access the login page. We'll go back one. And so the use of the authorize attribute for pages is fairly simple. If you know Blazor, then you know there's also, I think it's an imports.razor page where you can specify some certain namespaces to import, where you can also apply an authorize attribute there, and you might do that if you wanted to lock down the entire site to only authenticated users. So with role-based authorization in Blazor, it's pretty much the same. Again, we're using the authorize attribute, and in this case, the user needs to be a member of the administrator's role or the accounts role to access the counter page. Policy-based authorization, authorize attribute, again, we're applying the employees only policy. Okay, and as mentioned, there's a couple of helpful components. Here's the authorize view. In this case, authenticated users can access the home link. They can see the home link. It's not controlling access to the underlying route. They can see the counter link if they're a member of administrators or accounts, and they can see the user's link if they're an employee. Let's have a look. Here we've got the authorized view again, and it's kind of like allow anonymous. So if you're not authorized, you can see the login link. So this authorized view would be useful, say, for setting up a nav menu and other components in your system. So let's have a look at a demo now. So we're going to have a look at the basic approach to authorization with ASP.NET Core, and we're going to try adding a new role to an existing application. And this is the typical approach. Jump over to the code. So what I have here, as mentioned, is a Blazor WebAssembly app. hosted on ASP.NET Core. And it's pretty much out of the box, except I have this users menu where I can see the users that are in the system. And if I was to edit the user, I can assign roles to that user. Now, the existing roles don't have quite the permissions that this auditor user would require. And so I'd like to create a new auditor role so that I can basically give them read access to the system. So I have to create a new role for the auditor. So let me see. If I load up the code base here, let's see. Our roles are actually defined in a DB initializer that I've created, and they're stored in the database. And you can see I've got some constants and a magic string for the password. So that's the password for the system if you're looking for it. Like that bigger, thank you. There we go, password 123. You would have guessed it anyway. No point hiding it. So I'll create the auditors role, and it's going to be called auditors. Now if I scroll down here, we can see the roles being created. Make that even bigger. Whoops. Make that even bigger. There we go. So we'll duplicate that. And this one is going to be multi-cursor. I've messed that up there. We'll find out why. Okay. Oh yeah, I thought I fixed that, but I just made it much worse, didn't I? I started copying and pasting my error. Okay, so there's the auditor's role. So it's going to be created by the role manager. And there's our auditor. That's fine. So we'll save that. And I think I'm running .NET Watch over here, so it should tick over. I'm going to force it just in case. So a little control. You know, you launch your applications. If you're programming with Visual Studio and you're working with hot reload, I find it just much better to run it from the command line. So if you just go .NET Watch run, and then if you want to force a reload, like to regenerate your Open API spec or something, then you can just press Control R and it will do that for you. All right, so let's see if the role's available. Okay, the role's available, so we can click on that and save, and then log out, and we'll log back in as an auditor. It's not that. Auditor local host and password 123 exclamation mark. Log in. Yay. Okay, so we're in, but we don't have access to anything, right? Because there's more changes we have to make. Adding the role in itself is not enough. So let's see. Give me one sec. I've got to see over here, there, and then I've got to drag this cheat sheet for my demos. Give me a sec. Where is it? There. That's got to go there. All right. Just in case I forget something. Okay. So first thing we do is to update in client, pages, admin, users page. I want the auditor to be able to see the users in the system. And so this is the users page. So now it's going to be administrators or auditors. And I'll put that into clipboard because we're going to be making a lot of those changes. And then we'll go to counter. Currently it's just administrators or accounts, and now auditors can count things too. And fetch data, currently administrators and or operations, and now auditors can see the weather forecast too. And then we need to go to the nav menu. Now that's here in shared nav menu. And so we can see, let's see, what do we got? The authorized view component in action. So this is the counter. So we'll pop that in. And this is administrators and operations for weather forecast. And here's the users list. And we don't need to worry about the claims one. I think that's it, but that's not sufficient. So that'll, of course, give them access to see the menu items. It'll give them access to the pages, but it won't give them access to the API that sits behind it. So they won't be able to get the user data or get the weather forecast data. So we'll save that now and go over to our controllers. And we need to update the users controller. So they'll need access to basically get the users. We'll just make it quick auditors, and that probably gives them more access than they need, but that's okay. And to the roles controller, and also to the forecast controller. Okay, so I'll save that, see if it's ticking over. Should be good, but it keeps saying no hot reload changes to apply. That doesn't seem right. I'm just going to do it for it. So, yeah, I don't trust that. Okay, so let's refresh this. No, it's going to do it for me. There we go. Okay, so we've got access to the items in the nav menu, that's right. We can access the counter page, that's right. We can count things. We can go to fetch data. Data's coming back from the server, that's good. We can go to users and view the list of users. We could probably jump in here, but we're not authorized to edit a user because we didn't apply any kind of authorization policy to that page. So that's pretty good. We're done with adding the new role. So let's go back to our side deck. So in order to add the new auditor role, we had to do lots of code changes. We had to test them. We didn't test them, kind of beside a bit of clicking around. We have to now build and deploy this, right? This is not in production. This is just on my machine. So it has to be deployed to production. So the application's going to go offline when we do that. We have to document this access control that we just implemented, because no one knows how it works except the developer. And anytime the business says who has access to what are you going to say? I don't know. Let me have a look at the code base. No, you have to keep some documentation up to date to reflect that, and you have to keep it in sync. And of course, I've already forgotten to do that. And probably going to be some bug fixes. I'm pretty sure I gave too much access to the users controller. There's some actions in there that will update users that the auditor shouldn't have access to. And that's a lot of work, right? That was just an authorization change. We didn't even build a new feature. So that's the basic approach. Let's close some of this down. We won't need that again. And get rid of that. There we go. So next up, flexible authorization with ASP.NET Core. What exactly would that look like? Well, it would be easy to add new roles and to configure access control. It would be easy to reconfigure access control for existing roles. We should be able to remove roles without impacting any access control checks. We can't do that currently. We have to deploy a new version of the system if we're going to do that. It should be easy to view access control policies. Not just me, a developer looking at code, but the business. They should be able to see what the policies are and reconfigure them. And it should support all of the above as standard application features, right? They shouldn't need a developer to do any of this. So let's have a look at the flexible approach to authorization with ASP.NET Core and do the same thing. We'll add in the new auditor role. So here's the application. It's pretty much the same. It's got the users list, but it's got roles and it's got access control. So if I click on roles, I'm logged in as admin. Oh, cool, we have something to debug tonight. That's good. All right, let's do a refresh. So it looks like I'm not logged in, so we'll start there. That's worse, made it worse again. Admin at localhost, password 123. Admin has the same password, of course. Log in. Not now. Fetch data. Yeah, we're getting data back from the server. Okay. I was probably just not logged in properly. All right, so we can see the existing roles. I want to create a new role, auditor, auditors, and we'll go plus. And now I want to configure access control for that role. So we go to access control, and we can say you get the ability to view roles, to view users, to... Well, I want you to be able to see access control as an auditor, but I don't actually want you to configure it. Maybe we'll fix that one later. Counter and forecast. Now those changes are being synced with the server as we go. So if we log out and log back in as the auditor now, we should have the necessary level of access. Auditor at localhost password. Pretty sure I put a typo there. 1, 2, 3. Ooh. Okay, that's not working very well because I can't see stuff. What went wrong? Well, let's figure it out. Okay, so, I know what it is. I created the role. What was it?
You didn't give yourself the role.
Didn't give myself the role. Now I have to log in and log back out again. Get Notepad, password, 123. There we go. It's gonna be easier. Admin, I should turn off my touchpad. Admin at localhost, password. Okay, go away. Users, auditor, edit, auditor's role, save, log out, log in, and auditor, localhost. Go away. There we go. So we can count things, we can see the weather, we can list the users, a little bit better there because I've taken the time to remove the edit link. We haven't looked at claims. We can see the roles, we can't edit them, and we can see the access control, but actually we can change access. So that's not good, but we'll fix that too. All right, so back to the slide deck. So adding a new auditor role in this case was trivial. And those changes are live and they're documented, as you can see in the access control list there. If the business can see that, they can configure it. So it's all good to go. So the basic versus flexible approach. With the flexible approach, with the basic approach, we knew there was code changes, testing, CJK, safe trip. There was build and deploy, bug fixes, and documentation, which we didn't do. With the flexible approach, we weren't required as developers to be there. We had just free time. And that's great, right? Because then we can get to actually fixing an important bug or building the next feature rather than messing around with this stuff. So let's try one more demo for flexible authorization. Let's add a new permission to support a new requirement. And that requirement is that some users can view access control, some users can configure access control. So we'll go to our code base. Now normally when you're managing permissions, it's because some permission has changed, which you can do through access control in the application. But when you're creating new features or changing authorization requirements, that's when you might need to dive in the code. So in this case, we're creating the capability to view access control. So I have a list of permissions, which are an enumeration, and we'll look at those a little bit later. But I want to create a view access control permission. And we're going to go into all the details of how the engine works, but we'll just start by adding the permission. And then, see this, I need my other cheat sheet, because otherwise I will forget something, and then it will take us longer to get to beers. Let's see, tab, this one. There we go. Okay. All right, so we've added the permission, and now we can apply the permission. So we'll start on Blazor WebAssembly on the front end, and we'll go to the nav menu, which is in shared. And here you can see we're no longer applying roles, of course, we're applying permissions. And so for access control, there's one permission being applied, and it's configure access control. So we're going to say that now actually you can get to this section or see this link if you can view access control. There we go. Good. Okay, and then in the access control controller, where is that? That's in server. Under controllers, admin, access control. Whoops. Currently the entire controller is restricted to users who have the permission configure access control. We're going to change that. We'll make it so that a user who has the view access control permission can get the configuration, and a user who has the configure access control permission can update the configuration. All right, so now the permissions are in place, we need to update the access control page. So that's in admin access control index. We just have a checkbox here, and essentially when you check it, it will send that information back to the server and either enable that permission for the role or disable it. So we're going to use, you know what, I'm just going to grab the code. We're going to just do a flexible authorized view. Now, I've already introduced the authorized view component. I made an additional component based on that called the flexible authorized view component, which allows you to specify the permissions. So in this case, we're saying this is authorizing against the permission configure access control. If you are authorized, then the checkbox will be defined just like this with an onChange event that sets a permission. If you are not authorized, then it's basically just going to display the data and the input checkbox will be disabled. So let's clean that up. All right, so save those changes, see if it ticks over. I think it, oh yeah. So when this comes up, we just say always. And that way, next time it needs to do a restart because of a change, a dirty change, I think it's called. Is that what they call it, a dirty change or a filthy change or rude edit? Yeah, rude edit.
Set an environment variable.
Okay.
Automatically always reload on
Ah.
Windows. And so every app on your system will just auto reload every time.
That's a good way to do
You
it.
don't have to go A, and then
Yep.
you restart, you go A again, A again, A again.
Yep. Has everyone been doing a lot of ChatGPT? Like all the time. So right now I'm thinking I should go to ChatGPT and check what that environment variable is. And it'll tell me like instantly. It's just amazing. It's changed the way that I work in like the last few months completely. Just, yeah, I'm always pair programming now. Sometimes there's a third person. It's cool. All right, so let's see. We've rebuilt. We should be okay. Let's do a Control F5. We're logged in as an auditor. We can see access control. There's an error that's occurred. That's fine. We can see that it responded with a 403. So it was kind of forbidden. And let's see if I just kind of Control F5 here and see the network request was the problem. What else have I got?
On the get one, you don't have the only for view.
Oh yeah. And who am I logged in as? Auditor. Okay, let's have a look at that. So that was the access control controller. And I have permissions, view access control. And then here I have configure access control. It might be, except for one thing. We're logged in as the auditor. And yeah, I can't. I don't need to give it to the auditor because the auditor has the role auditors and it will inherit all of the permissions from any roles that it has. I did not. That's another way of saying it, isn't it? Let's have a look. Okay, logging out. That's what it is. Thank you. Okay. Admin at localhost. See, this flexible demos is supposed to be smooth and carefree, not like this. So ignore any of the little glitches here. Okay. Logging in. Go away. Access control. Auditors. Configure access control. There it is. Okay. Logging out. Log in again. Auditors at, it's getting worse, at localhost and password. Is that? Oh look, it's just completely reset now. Start again. Thank you. Okay.
Is that a shared account? What's going on?
It's just my general account with my normal password, you know. Okay, so we're logged in as an auditor, but I still see a problem here. Like, the auditor shouldn't have this. Did I save? Access control, index, this is access control. Do I have permissions configured? I didn't give why does auditor have, oh, that's from before. Oh, so glad there's so many people here today. Everyone knows what they're doing. All right. I'm not authorized to view. Okay, so this is the page. So now we have to go to the access control page and apply the permission here as well. So we're basically saying or view or configure. I need autosave for Visual Studio. There we go. That doesn't look good. One single F. It's not meant to be this funny. What did I do there? That's even. Oh, okay. I'm just being impatient now. I got to slow down. Yay! Hey.
It would go perfectly if nobody was watching.
Oh, I don't know about that. I tried to log in 3 times this afternoon just to check that everything was working and got it wrong. All right, so that's it. So we have the new view access control permission. Auditors can see the access control. They can't edit access control. So we added a permission, and it couldn't have been easier, right? Just a couple of changes here and there. All right, so let's see. So in order to add a permission to support the new requirement, we essentially needed code changes, testing, and a build and deploy. But none of that's extra work. This is stuff that we would have to do whenever we were building a new feature or implementing a new authorization policy, not assigning existing authorization policies. Okay? So how does it all work? How does this flexible authorization work? Well, first we need to create the necessary roles and permissions. Then we assign permissions to roles as required. We can add a permissions claim to an authenticated user. So a user will already have a roles claims with most identity systems. We assign those roles, that comes across in the claim, and then what we do is we collect all of the permissions associated with the roles and assign those directly to the user as well. We add permissions-based access control as required, so using authorized attributes, using the authorization service, which we haven't looked at, perhaps using some of those flexible authorization components that you saw, anything that you like. And that then gets enforced by dynamic authorization policies. So whenever you see one of these permissions-based access control checks, what the ASP.NET Core engine is actually doing is creating a policy to support those requirements. And that's how I've extended ASP.NET Core authorization, dynamic policies. So if we're managing roles, we know that roles define a logical grouping of users. Administrators can create new roles as required, or any authorized user really. The administrators can assign permissions to roles, but that being said, we need to avoid role-based authorization. So yes, we do use roles to manage logical groupings of users. They have permissions assigned, but we should really try to limit our role-based authorization checks because that's the part that's not flexible. You might get away with saying, you know what, this is just a role check for administrators. Administrators doesn't change. But roles based on organizational departments, they change all the time. Organizations restructure, department names changes, and they like to see those changes cascading across the organization, including your application. Yep.
So like role-based checks, you're talking about like limiting the scopes of the roles that the user has?
No, not at all. They can have as many roles as they normally would, but don't have role-based checks in code where you say, hey, this member must be a member of accounts or operations. We'll have permissions-based checks in code, but not roles. Permissions are, on the other hand, they're closely associated with the feature, right? View access control, configure access control, that's related to the feature. It's independent of the organization. It's very flexible, whereas roles, not so much. All right, so managing permissions. So permissions define granular access to resources. Developers create the permissions as necessary, usually when creating or changing a feature. Permissions are not assigned directly to a user. Like we don't go to a user and say, you have this permission, this permission, this permission. We just add them to roles. Permissions are assigned to a role, and the user inherits the permissions of any assigned roles. So how does the authorization engine work? Well, we know it's built entirely using policy-based authorization, and a custom authorize attribute, a custom flexible authorized view component, all those little bits and pieces that generally extend ASP.NET Core's authorization. And so what happens is when you use one of those kind of features, the required permissions are translated into a policy name. As an example, it may be it's policy 21. And that policy will then be dynamically created using a custom policy provider to enforce those permissions. So policy 21 might actually mean, it might mean a user is authorized if they have view access control and configure access control. That's what policy 21 could be. That will be the requirements of that policy. So let's have a look now at the flexible authorization engine and how it works. First thing I want to show you is something that I didn't think to load ahead of time is, let's see, open a file, not there, D drive. All my important stuff's in D drive. Code, Jason Taylor, yeah, games, and code. Flexible authorization, flexible auth. No, it must be back. There it is. All right, I've got this little notebook here that we can look at if it loads. So we've got our permissions stored as, let me zoom in, as an enumeration. And it's actually a flags enumeration. So you can see we have the flags attribute applied here. And applying this attribute means that the enum can be treated as a bit field, i.e. a set of flags. And so we can kind of combine and compose permissions in very interesting ways. So you can see that there has a couple of special values. So no permissions is indicated by 0, which is really just used internally. And all permissions is kind of the complement of 0, complement. So it's equal to, in this case, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1. So this is an interesting one because we can say apply it to administrators and they just get whatever the permissions are. We can also, well, let's have a look at some examples. So in this case, we want to say that the user's permissions are A and C, and the required permissions are A and B. So the user essentially has 00101. So they have this permission A, because that is this one, and C, which is this permission. So you can see these flags are really interesting. And the required permissions are essentially A and B. And so if we want to see if the user has the required permissions, well, let's run some of this code before we get ahead. We can output the permissions as a string. So these are the user's permissions, and that just comes out nicely as A and C. We can output the required permissions, A and B. And we can also output the permissions as its integer value, 5 and 3. Now we can check the permissions. So we're basically saying here that the user is satisfying those permissions. So they have either A or B. So we can use the logical OR operator to add a permission. So currently the user permissions are A and C. We can add in permission B, A, B, and C. We can remove a permission using the exclusive OR operator. Now it's back to A and C. And we can, let's reset the required permissions. We can generate a policy name. So you can see the policy name, just scrolling down a little bit, that I'm generating is very much based on the value of the required permissions. And so what the authorization will do is take that value and cast it back into the enumeration so that it then knows the required permissions. Scrolling down. So we can update the required permissions in the policy name. So the required permissions is A, B, and C now, which is the value of 7, so it's permission 7. Whereas before, A and B, permissions 3. So each combination of these flags will produce a unique integer which can be used to name the policy. And then we can get the permissions back based on the policy name. So here we're saying we take the integer value from the policy name as the permissions value, and we cast that back into the permissions type, and that gives us required permissions A, B, and C. Now this is all fun. It's really great to work with bitwise operators, but really I haven't had to do too much of that within the engine itself, other than for the dynamic policy doing that final permissions check, which was essentially this one here. All right, so let's start to work through some of the other areas of the system. And we'll start with the permissions. So you can see here that as an auditor, the permissions value that I have, which is stored as a claim, is 229. And of course that indicates some combination. Just find that. I'll go this way. Some combination of these permissions, okay? So view roles plus view users plus counter plus forecast plus view access control equals 229. And so the claims represent the permissions. All right, so let's see, the application user claims principal factory is responsible for adding that permissions claim to the token. So in essence, what it does is it looks at the authenticated user, it grabs all of those roles, it grabs all of the permissions for all of those roles, joins it back into one value, so the user now has all the permissions from all of those roles, and assigns it to the claim. Okay. Then in shared authorization, we have the, let's see, that's down here, the flexible authorization policy provider. So this is, I'll just zoom in a little bit more. So this is based on the default authorization policy provider. There can only be one policy provider in ASP.NET Core. So we extend that and register it. And essentially, it's quite simple. We try to get the policy by its name. Okay, that's how policy authorization works. There's a policy name, employees only. We try to find that policy. In this case, it won't exist. So we say if the policy is null and the policy name helper is a valid policy name, so it's permissions something, right? That's what this little check does. Then it goes ahead and creates a policy. So policies have permissions. So this policy has permissions. So we then use the policy name helper to get permissions from the policy name. So we'll go in and have a quick peek at that. So to get permissions from the policy name, it takes the integer value and casts it back into permissions. So we then have all of the permissions that are needed for this policy. And then it creates a new policy. So you can see it's building a authorization policy builder. It's adding the requirement. It only has one requirement, a permission authorization requirement, where we pass in the required permissions. Then we call build to get the actual authorization policy. We go ahead and add that policy and then return it. So next time a same check is made for the same set of permissions, that policy will already exist. So it creates it kind of in a lazy fashion, but it doesn't create it more than once. So there's a couple of things that we need to dive into there. The permission authorization requirement. All policies have requirements, and this is a custom requirement. You can see it's based on authorization requirement or implements. And all it does is pass in the permissions and actually set them to an underlying property. So it's just a data container. But what actually checks that requirement? Let's find that. So that is managed by the permission authorization handler. So first it tries to find the permission claim. If it can't find the claim, then it's done and the user will not be authorized. It tries to pass the permission claim value. If it can't do that, it bails. And finally, if it can, then it says these are the user permissions. We're going to ensure that the user has at least one of these permissions, and if that's the case, only then will it succeed and return. Otherwise, it returns, and because we didn't call context.succeed, that requirement, that authorization requirement, will be marked as denied. Okay. So dynamic policies with requirements that contain permissions that ensure that the user has those permissions. Let's have a look at what else we got. Here's our authorize attribute. So this is the authorize attribute that I'm using throughout the system. It's based on the built-in authorize attribute, but I just have a couple of additional methods. So there's the constructor, which allows me to pass permissions directly in. And then there's also the property, which sits behind the permissions. And you can see here, it's not setting any value on the authorize attribute. It's actually using policy-based authorization right there. So it actually goes and sets the policy name. So we could do this another way, right? We could, so if I went to the access control controller, I could say, don't do that, authorize policy equals permissions 21. It's still the same thing, but I can do that, or I could pass in the permissions. Okay, when we pass in the permissions, all it does is set the correct policy name. So this is just a little kind of bit of syntactic sugar just to help us. All right, so we've looked at the application user claims principal factory. That's responsible for setting the permissions claim. We've looked at the dynamic policies and the requirements and the handlers that sit behind that. We didn't look at the authorization service. So I've created a very simple extension method for the authorization service. So the authorization service is built into ASP.NET Core. It allows you to enforce authorization requirements in blocks of code, so procedural code that you might want to do these checks for. I have an extension method that basically allows you to pass in the user's claims, that the user, the required permissions. That should say required permissions. That would be a much better name. And then it just goes ahead and says, hey, authorize against this policy. And we just generate that policy name on the fly, and it will dynamically create it if needed and perform those checks against the permission requirement. So I think that's pretty much it for the engine. I know it's a bit of a whirlwind, but the code is on GitHub, so you can review it and ask me questions. But I'll stop here. And does anyone have any questions at this stage? Yep. Yeah, no, go.
Just quick one. In your MVC page, you had two sections. There was angle bracket authorized and angle bracket not authorized.
Yes.
Not authorized a function of flexible.
Can you repeat your question
Yes.
on the screen too?
Yes. So in the Blazor WebAssembly front end, I am using the flexible authorize view component. Let me just show you that again. And that's a good point. I didn't come back to that. Here's the component. This is called flexible authorize view, and it's based on the authorized view that is built into Blazor. Okay, and so I've kind of extended that by just simply adding a permissions property, which then sets again the underlying policy name. So it's working in exactly the same way. And so when we go to use that, which we did in here, we have this flexible authorized view. We specify the access control requirements, which is you must have configure access control. If you are authorized, if you have that permission, then you will get a checkbox which is enabled and allow you to set permissions. If you are not authorized, then you'll get a checkbox that is disabled and you'll only be able to view permissions.
So that not authorized built-in part of Blazor.
Yes.
That's not something you were chasing.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, I just built the component and extended it with this permissions property. Next question? Yes?
Is there a limit on how many permissions you can make?
Yes, great question. With the current implementation, there's 64. Okay, so that means 64 permissions with a enum flags version. At that point, you kind of have to decide, do I want to then move on to storing the permissions in a static class with string constants? It's nice to have that strongly typed authorized checks. I really like that. You might like to move it to the database. We were having an interesting conversation earlier before the presentation started about doing the permissions checked based on routes. And so we've done that before as well, where we would enumerate through all of the routes, in this case, again, in a Blazor application, and those would be the actual permissions. And so we would authorize or not authorize users based on the routes that they can access. Yes?
Another way. Yeah. Just brief on that one. I did something similar with Enos. Instead of putting the 1, 2, 4, 8, 16,
Yes.
use 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, use the bit vector and a bit shift with the double angle bracket, shifting 1 to the value.
Okay.
In that code, you could detect a value of 64 and shift it to it in the second byte.
Oh, excellent. Yeah, I've seen some stuff on that, but I haven't tried it myself.
Say that again.
Yeah, so in this case, you use the bit vector with.
Using a bit shift on a plane either.
Yeah, that's right. And so they were numbered 1, 2, 3, 4 all the way through, and so you could detect greater than 64,
Yes.
and then shift to the next vector.
Yes.
That's right. Cool. That sounds good. Okay, next question. Yes.
Have you heard of CASB?
Caspi? No.
We use it at work, but it is for managing larger scale of authorization, but this is different.
Okay.
I just wanted to see whether you have an idea about the difference.
Sorry, no, I haven't heard of Caspi, so I don't know the difference. Caspine. Yeah, sorry, I haven't. No, thank you. Yes.
Is there a reason why the attribute is called authorized attribute and not flexible authorized attribute?
Oh.
Is it like a naming convention or is it?
Yeah. Let me load it up. So it's a good question. Is there a reason why this custom authorized attribute is not called flexible authorized attribute? Is it a naming convention? Well, I could have called it anything, really. I could have called it permissions if I wanted to, and I could definitely call it flexible authorized attribute. My goal really was to extend ASP.NET Core authorization in a fairly transparent way and just provide the capability to supply permissions as part of your requirements. And so even with that flexible authorized view, I would have rather called that authorized view, but I just found it a bit tricky to get that to work. So yeah, but if you wanted to go the other way and make it clear that this is a custom component, this is a flexible authorized attribute, you could do that too. So be no problem. Cool. Yes?
You created the permission and roles in one of the class in the application, right?
Yes.
In terms of scalability and
Yes.
security,
Yes.
where you would save it and how you would transfer or bring the data to the application?
So I create, so the question is in terms of scalability for managing this solution, I create the roles in the database in this particular one. You didn't see the creation of roles in the flexible authorization demo because that's just going straight into the database. The permissions themselves are managed in code. And so I guess your question is around how scalable the solution is for large, complex organizations?
Yeah, for security as well.
Yeah, for security. Okay, so the idea behind this demonstration is simpler than that. We're essentially using a token which contains roles, which we then add permissions to. And so we then use permissions to perform authorization checks based on those token values. Everything that goes around that, everything that's outside of the scope of those values in the token and the dynamically building of the policy can be implemented in whichever way you feel works well for your solution. So I'm using roles in the database and permissions in an enumeration. That can all change to suit your requirements. So really the main thing here is we can leverage as ASP.NET Core's extensibility to dynamically build policies to perform authorization checks for us. Make sense? Cool. Yes?
Is it possible to go one step further and actually not even have the enum for the permissions and have the administrator create the permissions and then documentate and store the
Yeah.
DB table? Is it possible to do that, or is that just too convoluted?
So I'll repeat the question. Is it possible to go one step further and not have the permissions defined in code, have the administrator create the permissions? It is, but we have a chicken and an egg situation there. First, the administrator needs to create the permissions, and then those checks need to be defined somewhere. So yes, we can create the administrator can create the permissions, but we still need to define the checks. Now there are some things that we can do kind of dynamically. Like I mentioned before, we could enumerate all of the routes of our system and apply access control to those routes. So then we might have a tiny little enum that says view, edit, or what's SharePoint use? Contribute or view, maybe those two permissions, and you can apply that at every single route level. So you could kind of get some really nice quick results that way, and then you could use other permissions check for more granular access. So yeah, but once you're creating the permissions in the database, you still need to apply those checks somehow. Cool.
Have you found this gives better alignment talking about functionality with the business? They usually want to say, hey, we want this new functionality and only, I don't know, admins or
Yes.
employees should be able to do it, or they want to say,
Yes.
they need these permissions?
So have I found this gives better alignment when talking about permissions with the business? Yes, most definitely. In most of the projects that I work on, we will have a spreadsheet that says, these are the roles and here are the permissions, and we'll put little yeses or nos or check boxes in each one of those cells. And so I think it's easy for me to visualize, and it's easy for the business to visualize, and it ends up being, this in a spreadsheet, and then we go and kind of enforce all of those permissions. Any final questions? Yes?
Hey. You mentioned before with the enum situation, you could
Yes.
do maximum 64 permissions.
Yes.
If you decided to shrink them and
Yep.
add some new ones,
Yep.
would that affect the previous implementations of adding?
Yes. Yes, so you have to look at the values. Where is it? Yes, of course. So we mentioned there's a maximum of 64. I think we can go to 128 if we switch it to long. So we do have a little bit more scope there. But if we do add new permissions, we need to have the existing permissions retain their value and ideally not reuse a value. And so you can see, while I would have liked to have put view access control above configure access control, I didn't do that because that would have put everything out of alignment. But there'd be, this is an implementation detail. How we define our permissions can be really driven by how we'd like to use it. And yeah, that's it. Cool. All right, I think I'll wrap it up. Let's see. No problem.
Just a couple of minutes for a toilet break, grab some more pizza, grab another drink, there's water and everything, and then